advisor or climate security advisor to the mission. It's great fun. We've been working together for the last 2 years, and we met this morning for the first time in person. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Chris. Thank you for that. And yeah, let's maybe start off with the essential question: why do we need a climate security advisor in Somalia and as part of a peace building mission in Somalia?
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it's great to have me, and thanks for inviting me, and great to see so many people here as well. So I'm the first climate security advisor to a special political mission or to a peacekeeping mission. And yeah, I mean, really, why do you need the position? I think that what is important is to bring the climate science and the climate data and the climate information together with the sort of infuse that with the peace building. And I think there have been PDAs, there have been environmental advisors, but this is the first role that really tries to bring together climate science and climate data and try to infuse that into conflict and conflict analysis, as well as looking at environmental protection. So my role is quite broad, but it allows us to focus on climate, the sort of human security and the environmental security. Because I think before it's been very much sort of environmental protection, or it's been very much conflict, but we haven't had that bringing the data and the evidence from a science perspective in to trying to look at how do we influence that. So yeah, I think that's why it's really important.
No, excellent. But so maybe you can outline a little bit the challenges that a mission like UNSOM in Somalia is actually facing in the light of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely huge. I mean, really, Somalia is at the forefront of climate change, with 7 odd million people in dire need of humanitarian support. Something like 3.6, I think, million people that are displaced due to, and it goes in waves between conflict and environmental disasters. But we can see the trend of environmental impacts like flooding and drought increasing over the years, so we can see that that's happening. So really, Somalia faces not just constant now annual cyclical droughts and flooding, but there's also cyclones, there's also massive deforestation, and that is all causing this big sort of changes and competition over those resources like water and grazing lands. And that's what's caused that. We'll go into that in a minute, but there's no direct correlation between climate and conflict, but what we can see now more and more that there are sort of pathways and interlinkages between the two.
Yeah, I think that is something that resonates very well also with the work that we are doing on climate-related security risks in Somalia. At the moment, Somalia is facing a massive drought, as you mentioned. Can you give us a little bit more of an impression, like how the situation is on the ground at the moment?
Yeah, no, it's very dry, very dry, very dire.
That's good with it.
So basically, in areas, this is. We're facing a possible 4th or 5th failed rains. This is the first, this is like sort of in the last 40 years, we're seeing this increasing and getting worse and worse and worse. And so really, huge humanitarian needs, large amounts of displaced populations, and really people really competing over this issue of water. But what's interesting in Somalia is actually, there is quite a lot of water. There's there are the 2 big rivers. There's, precipitation that happens. But what's happening is before it used to be a regular sort of cycle, and we could, farmers and herders and pastoralists would know how to, where to go and when to go to different places. But now more and more with climate change, it's the precipitation rain is just hitting the ground, it's running off, and part of that is due to deforestation, part of it is due to movement of populations, but really that's soil health and what's happening on the ground. So I can give you an example in Puntland, for example. The road outside Garowe used to in the 1950s used to have forest or some low-level forest with lions in some places, and now it's very much just dry and very, very sort of like a desert. And so what happens is the rain hits, it then creates gullies and it shoots off straight to the ocean. And so that the situation around the drought is exacerbating partly by climate change, but partly because of human also, degradation, chopping down trees, movement of population. That's also contributing to the rapid soil degradation that's then contributing further to the drought.
Yeah, which is some of the dynamics that are sort of the double exposure that Somalia is facing, right? With decades of conflict on the one hand, which are feeding into the deforestation dynamics, of course, but then the additional impact of climate change.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned your task as being around integration of data and bringing in the climate science and that part. So how are you doing that in this situation now?
Yeah, so basically I've been in position for about 2 years now, and so part of my role is really trying to do the advocacy and bringing the data and information. But I'll work with organizations like SIPRI, the SIPRI fact sheet on Somalia, and then I also mentioned, Adelphi and the weathering risk report. So there's quite a lot of data out there, and what we've tried to do is bring in the analysis from the IPCC reports as well as some of the climate data and science, which is fairly macro level, and so we've been trying to bring all that together to try to bring the information and data. And so with that data, we can sort of say that by 2080, and this is what I tried talking more around, is that development and international actors need to think about Somalia from this sort of vision of 2080. And the reality is that we can't go back to the Barre regime or the time when Somalia exported bananas and was quite a big flourishing economy, because climate change is really going to impact that. So if we look at the fairly concrete science with relatively high levels of confidence, we can say that Somalia by 2080 will be in a 3 to 4 degree rise in temperature above average mean levels, right? So that means huge swathes of land won't be livable, and it means there's recent research in terms of cattle. Cattle can only live at like 1.5 degree area, so cattle can't live in the area. Camels can only go to a certain level as well. So the whole herder movement nomadic lifestyle is going to change, and really it's a big push into urbanization in Somalia, and so that's the sort of drive that we're seeing, and I think that really that's the sort of the science that we need to bring in, and looking at that, like, okay, so this is the model of 2080. There's also medium levels of confidence in the fact that we'll have 50% less water by 2080. So if we're thinking 50% less water and a 3 to 4 degree rise by 2080, there's going to be a big change. And so what is that going to mean in terms of movement of populations, and but also what is it going to mean in terms of conflict and competition over the resources? So what we've been trying to do through platforms like Strata and the UNEP data platform that tries to look at hotspot mapping, of trying to overlay things like conflict data with climate change data and with social vulnerability indicators, and we're then trying to map out certain hotspots. And with that, we're going to hopefully work with the Somali government and work with the international actors to try to figure out what do these hotspots mean over the next years, and trying to figure out that. So I'm trying to do a lot of work around data and information and gathering and getting all that together. But on top of that, what we're trying to do is not only provide the sort of doomsday scenario information, but also trying to figure out what can we do about it. And so part of that is around training, capacity building, support. So we work very closely with our colleagues in the federal government. We're very excited with the new government. Hopefully there'll be a Ministry of Environment, and there'll be lots of sort of new policies going forward. And then the idea is that then we're sort of supporting and building that capacity, because there has to be a sort of top-down policy structural systems approach, but it also has to be a bottom-up, trying to support communities and community-based organizations as well. So a lot of that is around working with CSOs, NGOs, trying to work with the government and in partnerships. And the other part of my role is really also coordination. So trying to coordinate different actors and bring them all together and trying to work on things. So on the coordination front, we're trying to look at how do we work together to actually look at this issue of water. So how can you bring communities, and often Somali businesses are the ones that really bring a lot of localized expertise and drive to try to solve the situation, and then working with NGOs like Save the Children and others that, and then also bringing UN agencies like FAO and others to bring that together. And we've started this great piece of work where we try to coordinate the defense mechanisms of the flooding along the Shabelle River, and we're trying to look at this from a short, medium and longer term perspective, because really all this is about the nexus, and we really have to bring humanitarian development and peace actors together to try to solve the issues together. Because really, at the moment, we've got humanitarians over here doing a quick fix, providing of cash or transfers, and we've got development organizations over here doing something completely different, and then the stabilization partners in a completely different area. And what we need to do is try to bring them together to think, okay, police, military, maritime authorities need to work with those humanitarian organizations, and they need to work with the development organizations, say this is what we've got to do. And so the examples are things like the sandbags that save that breakage right now, with, for example, the sort of medium-term development agencies that will say, okay, let's do the sort of slope stabilization here to stop the bank eroding, and then the long term is the modeling over nature-based solutions. So these are the sort of things we're trying to do together.
I think that's always like I heard you speak before, and it's always the thing when Chris starts talking about what he's actually doing. It's impressive that you're one person in the mission, essentially, who is doing all of that. It shows the tremendous need and work and the lack of coordination that is really a problem. I want to come back to some of the things you said in a moment, but there's one question that's always puzzling, I think, in this field, and that comes from this double exposure, this double burden, like we're facing. You're working in a country where, on the one hand, you have tremendous development challenges, climate security challenges, climate impacts, and the work on flooding that you mentioned for flood reduction. At the same time, you're working in a conflict environment. What needs to come first, especially in a context like this, where we see that some of the climate dynamics are part of the conflict dynamics, that part of the conflict dynamics are impacting the environmental dynamics. So what comes first? Do we need to resolve the conflict first? Do we need to fix the environment first?
So I think it's that chicken and egg question. I think that there's no clear answers. I ultimately think you need to do it together, and that's what everybody. I mean, I was speaking to colleagues the other day, and they were saying, well, what's the point of doing environmental protection and environmental work or adaptation work? Because unless you've got some sort of stability or police or military sort of stability, you can't do that. And in some ways, that's why militant groups are so successful, because they can provide that security and stability that at the moment the international community haven't managed to get there. But we're working on it, and it's getting. But it's one thing that we need to sort of realize is that there's something around it. So I would say, ultimately, environmental protection and the sort of management of the natural resources goes hand in hand with the peace building, and this is where we're trying to work with, local police forces, with the clan elders, to try to work on this issue of you have to do state or peace building and that sort of work hand in hand with environmental protection. It has to come together, because really, unless you've got the environmental stability and the environmental protection, you cannot build a longer lasting peace, and you can't do the longer lasting peace unless you have this stability. So, I
mean, you mentioned the work you're doing with the government, with civil society. I want to zoom in a little bit on the mission itself. So, talking to colleagues, like, do they recognize this challenge? Is that something, because I can imagine within the complexity that is the UN mission, there are a lot of different priorities. Some of the more conflict-focused colleagues will probably have different priorities than some on the humanitarian development spectrum. So what is the challenge?
No, I mean, it's exactly that. It's trying to get the priorities, and ultimately, climate change is a longer term issue, right? So everybody sees it in this, longer term. So they think, okay, well, part of it is, the politics and the here and now. People are dealing with what happens now, but actually, the impacts of climate change are here and now, and so people have to, try to do it. But I mean, yes, it's exactly that. It's trying to get the priority up. So it's really, for the humanitarians, for example, we have long debates around. We're spending $1 billion a year, for example, on the humanitarian response plan in Somalia. If we were to just take a small amount of that to do environmental protection, we would save probably a lot more lives in the longer term perspective. But the problem is that's taking away a small amount of money from saving someone's life. So how do you get that priority? So, I mean, people always say, well, you can't save a life by planting a tree. And I said, well, no, you can't do it right now, but you can do it. It will save lives in the longer run. So you have to think about the longer term in the short-term response, and that's the hard part. But it's the same in the security and the police and the military. It's very difficult to get the priority of environmental protection up the sort of up the scale of priority. So, and it's the same in the development perspective as well. Like, often people think that the solutions on a development perspective is very much dams or big concrete responses, and really we've got to think about it much more in this sort of longer term, sustainable, nature-based approaches, and so it's really the prioritization. But the thing is like there has been some great successes in there are certain champions, and that's what it is finding those champions that really understand the long term in the short term, and I think that I found those in the maritime have been great. We've done some really great trainings with the maritime authorities. The police, we've started getting that into some of the strategies, and then with the military, we're still getting there. But hopefully, we've got some good opportunities.
How do you do that? I mean, your position is anchored or situated first within UNEP, who's then seconding you to the mission, right? So a lot of the things that resonate a lot with the work of UNEP, nature-based solutions, etc. Like, how do you bring the political side, the political peace building side, really in there, and especially then you're pointing out bridging the long-term perspective, which we all know is really important and it's really challenging. At the same time, UNSOM has a mandate of a year. Right. So how much work can you really do there? How is that limiting your work, and what would be things that well, I guess the international community or a change in the mandate could do in supporting your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the mandate is already very advanced for a political mission, and the leadership in UNSOM is very, very supportive and very driven, and they really see this as a high priority. So I think on the one side that's not the issue. I think you're right, the short termness of it all, and I think that sort of expanding the mandate to really, because as you know, we've had this conversation several times, the sort of theory of climate security is very much talking about risk and risk analysis and risk, but there's very little around risk management and strategies and what to do about on the ground. And I think that trying to maybe think about infusing more language around specifically what do we do about it. But I guess that's what my role is, to try to pilot certain things, to try to figure out what works. And so that's what we hopefully can show over the next years that's coming through.
Yeah. We don't have a lot of time, but we want to take the opportunity to take some questions from the audience also. So my colleague is having a microphone, so please raise your hand, and after I ask one more question, we'll take one or two questions before we need to round up. So you're in place for 2 years. You're doing a lot of work. How has UNSOM as a mission changed?
Yeah, no, I mean, hopefully I would say in a good way, but yeah, I mean, I think that we've really sort of infused the cooperation framework, which is the sort of the UN contribution to the National Development Plan, with climate and climate security approaches. I think we've mainstreamed it quite a lot in terms of the police and the military and the maritime authorities. I think that we've really supported the federal government and several member states around their approaches and policies. And I think we've got some really exciting pilots on the ground. So we've got this one environmental mediation pilot in Hirschfeld State that we're launching that will hopefully lead to some sort of building of peace around that. We've got this project with IOM looking at climate displacement and how do we try to break that cycle of displacement. And we've got this flooding project that has hopefully been fairly successful that will hopefully lead then to also moving that type of modality of looking at breakages and then move that onto drought, where we look at critical water sources and building in climate projections of water, underground management of water, and looking at that water conflict nexus as well. So really these pilot programs coupled with the mainstreaming with the coordination, I think will hopefully lead to a much more successful, both helping the peace process, but also helping build the capacities around understanding the impact of climate change, but also the future ones and what we need to do now to try to avert some of that.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah. We have one question. I look at the time, and we let's take two questions, and then Mariko.
Thank you very much, Mariko Peters of the EAS, the EU External Action Service. There's a new federal government now in the make. If you would be for one day their national climate security advisor, what would your top advice be at the federal level? And can you tell us a bit more about how federal member states are on board with this agenda? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. Or should we take?
Let's take another question and then.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ragi from Somalia European Youth Forum, and thank you for the good information. And I'm wondering, how is the diaspora involved in this process? Because I believe that we all have the same aim. How can we join our effort together for better Somalia?
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Yes, so great to see you again. We met online, but so great to actually see people again. But I think in terms of what I would say, the priorities is really around one. I think strengthening there's a lot of policies out there, specifically on charcoal and on land use and rangeland management, and I think a lot of those got stalled in the previous cabinet and parliament. So I would sort of support the new government to really try to relook at those policies and then try to see how we can move those forward. So I think at the sort of central level, it's around building that policy and that framework around that. But I think that furthermore, I would even go further to sort of say, how can we build climate security into things like the discussions around the new constitution. So one of the big things is around how do we get to that constitutional discussions? How do we get to also looking at the reconciliation frameworks and some of these key policies and systems that the new government are going to have to face over the next years, and trying to make sure that climate change is infused with that, but also how do you look at climate risk analysis, climate risk programming into all those policies? So how do we look at these projections, the climate suggestions, and bringing that central to all these things? And this is not, it's not something only focusing on environment or the environmental ministry. This is something that has to be mainstreamed across all the other ministries. So whatever the new structures are in government, I think it's really important that climate security and climate change gets infused, and that climate risk analysis and climate change thinking is really important to that. So that's the sort of thing. And I think at the federal member states, there's obviously varying different levels of interest and support, but I think that overall the ones I've visited, are very, very supportive, because they are definitely seeing the impacts of climate change and they recognise the importance of this. So I think that that's a really important thing. I think the last thing I'd probably mention to both federal member state and to the federal government is around the fact that there is going to be more and more pledging around green climate financing and green funding. But the problem with green climate financing currently is it's not as suited to fragile states as it is to other countries. So I think that one of the things is try to advocate for different countries around the world that are contributing to green climate financing to actually focus on fragile states as part of this, because Somalia, for example, has they haven't applied for the adaptation fund, for example. They have applied for GCF, but GCF can take up to 10 years. So really you need something that will work for humanitarian and fragile state systems. So that's it. And I think in terms of your question, Ragi, so thank you for that. I think that, really what I was just mentioning, like last week, there was the Swedish government supported a youth forum in Mogadishu, and I think that there's more and more of that coming. So there are, community networks. We've been trying to reach out to NGOs and trying to bring together. I am actually trying to set up a climate security working group across Somalia with different NGOs and CSOs. So it'd be great to have you join that. But I think that there are a lot of different forums and coordination. Like you said, there's the Somali Forum, Youth Forum coming up. I think that those sort of things is great, that we try to just bring everybody together and just talk and try to bring as much forward. And like you said, there's also the Stockholm Forum conference next week on youth and specifically around UNEP and how it works. But I think really there's so much passion and drive in the young around climate change. And I think that we really just need to harness that and link that social contract that the new government has to that youth. And I think that's where the UN can help. I think that organisations like yours is really important. So no, really, really great. So, yeah.
I know there are more questions, but we're really running out of time, and you can't come too late to the opening and the launch of the Environment of Peace report, of course. But Chris, we clearly see there's a lot of work still to be done. It's really great to hear. Last question. We know that your position is essentially being replicated in a lot of other contexts, which is really important because we see how important and how challenging these environments are. In one sentence, what is your advice for your fellow colleagues that will be deployed in Mali, in Juba, or in other places?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like stay calm because there's so much to focus on, and you get pulled in so many directions. Because this is such an interesting area, and the whole point of climate, does go across. Climate security does come from sort of climate data. It comes from human security. It comes from environmental protection. So this sort of nexus between the three is where they have to do. So focus down on priorities, really try to think around, maybe 4 or 5 priorities that you try to set out and work on that are achievable, and really try to focus on those. And then also to say that they can also reach out to me and ask for any advice.
Yeah.
Not that I'll be able to give much, but yeah.
No, thank you so much, Chris. Congratulations on the excellent work you do, and thank you so much for joining us here today. Chris will be around for a few more days, so please run into him and catch a coffee. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Florian.
Enjoy the Stockholm Forum.
Thank you. Yes, enjoy.
Yeah.